the world of Squid Game, almost nobody is fully innocent. Competing in a series of kids games to either pay off your debts or literally die trying leads to no shortage of violence, betrayal, and downright depravity. Today we're going to do our best to rank every Squid Game character's worst deed, from those who could easily atone to those who've earned a one-way trip to the bad place. First, we'll talk about the characters who don't really have any deeds bad enough to stand out in comparison to their peers. These are the basic human flaws. We'll start out with three characters we'd consider to be essentially innocent: Myung-gi, Jun-hee, and Kyung-seok. The absolute worst thing these three did was participate in the Squid Game at all, and even then we can't really say they're guilty of anything but getting into a very horrible situation out of desperation. They each had noble reasons for competing and never resorted to unnecessary violence or deception. Jun-hee wanted to provide for her unborn child, Kyung-seok needed money to pay for his young daughter's blood cancer treatment, and while we don't know much about Myung-gi compared to the others, we do know that she was the most visibly terrified of continuing the games, even going so far as to beg the other players to vote X. On that note, these three each consistently voted to terminate the games, meaning that even in their desperation, they still had the clarity to fully embrace the truth that this game was way too messed up to willingly participate in. Following them is the absolute legend from Season 1, Ali Abdul, whose worst deed was indirectly injuring his boss. During the players' time away from the Squid Game in Season 1, we saw that Ali's manager was one of many people who took advantage of his kindness. You see, this poor, overworked businessman was just so busy playing solitaire on his computer that he didn't have time to pay his undocumented workers. But Ali couldn't ignore the envelope full of cash on his desk, which led to a struggle between the two that led his boss's hand into a dangerous metal machine that absolutely demolished his hand. On one hand, which is oddly enough the same amount Ali's boss has left, leaving someone behind after an injury like that would usually be a pretty messed up thing to do. Like, how's he supposed to play solitaire now? But when you consider that Ali was an undocumented worker struggling to provide for his family and literally just wanted to be paid the money he was owed, that choice becomes way more understandable. The guy would have probably lost everything if he'd waited for help to arrive. Plus, Ali lost several fingers due to his boss's dangerous working conditions, so we'd just say this amounts to karma. And rounding out this category is Gyum-ja, whose worst deed was insulting Hyun-ju. You know, that one relative at Christmas or Thanksgiving who says the kind of stuff where you can tell they aren't trying to be offensive even when they are being offensive? Yeah, that's Gyum-ja. You'd be forgiven for thinking that her calling Hyun-ju unsightly was an indication that she was going to be one of the more unpleasant players of the season, which would be incorrect since 1, she was the GOAT, and 2, she genuinely came around to liking Hyun-ju as a person despite not really understanding her lifestyle. She's realistic and won't lie about what she thinks and how she feels, but she knows how to give people a chance and to treat them with decency and respect. A balance we could all learn a little something from. Now let's move on to the characters who've made some more severe mistakes, but did so with good enough reasons to chalk these up as understandable misdeeds. Our dearly beloved, dearly departed Sae-mi is next, with her worst deed being manipulating Thanos and Nam-gyu. By her own admission, Sae-mi was only allied with Thanos and Nam-gyu because they were stupid enough to be easily kept in line. We had to mention this since it does show that Sae-mi has a manipulative side, but honestly, she didn't really do anything manipulative per se. It's more like she was willing to if the situation demanded it. Like, yeah, teaming up with the mentally unstable drug addict SoundCloud rapper wasn't a good decision in general, but just like anyone there, Sae-mi was just sticking to the strongest people she could find. She was always compassionate and loyal and was fully ready to risk dying to stick with Min-soo rather than screwing him over in the Mingle challenge. What a kind-hearted gesture, and one we're absolutely certain will be met with proper gratitude and devotion. Up next, we have Jun-hee, everyone's favorite undercover detective whose worst deed was not disclosing the frontman's identity. Of all the reveals in the last few episodes of Squid Game's first season, perhaps the most heartbreaking was that the brother Jun-hee had infiltrated the Squid Game to track down was actually running it the entire time. That's gotta be the worst possible ending for Jun-hee, and to add injury to other injury, he was shot point blank in the chest and fell into the ocean below. Once he's rescued and eventually wakes up, Jun-hee cooperates with Gi-hun and some other allies to track down the island the games are being held on, but he refuses to reveal the identity of the frontman. We can't say we don't understand it. Of course, the guy doesn't want his own brother to be killed even after he proved he wouldn't hesitate to shoot Jun-hee himself, but it's possible that knowing the frontman's identity could have helped further the investigation on some level, so he's still guilty of withholding some pretty crucial information. Thanks for playing with us so far. Next is Ji-young, whose worst deed was killing her father. That's right, we already have our first murder to discuss. Now, that's a really tough one to spin in a positive light, but don't worry. Ji-young had about as good a reason for patricide as anyone. She witnessed her father stab her own mother to death, and as if that weren't vile enough, he proceeded to pray for forgiveness. Look, praying for forgiveness is is great, if you actually mean it, but this guy was a pastor who abused his wife and was implied to assault his own daughter. I don't think anyone could blame Ji-young, his teenage daughter, for avenging her mother by murdering her hypocritical scumbag of a father. This wasn't the case of a heartless murder, it was the case of a troubled, scarred child finally reaching her breaking point. I'll admit, I'm pretty surprised at how low Min-yo ended up on our list. Her worst deed was killing Deok-soo. Now, I could have sworn Min-yo did way more shady stuff throughout the season, but I guess it was just the vibe she gave off in general. Min-yo was generally rude, self-absorbed, and materialistic, but looking back on her character, she never really tries to actively hurt anyone. Not when it isn't warranted, that is. Enter Deok-soo, a mass-murdering gang criminal and terrorist who never shows any amount of loyalty, compassion, nor basic human decency beyond what he needs to use people to his own devices. When he makes the mistake of having a one-night stand, or more of a one-night sit, looking back at it, with Min-yo only to dump her after promising they'd make it to the end together, she made good on her promise to kill him if he betrayed her. In the Glass Stepping Stones challenge, she exposed Deok-soo for the coward he was by throwing him along with herself into the depths below the bridge while he begged for mercy. Given how Deok-soo was a complete scumbag and a mass murderer himself, not to mention how him waiting any longer to move would have led to 5 other deaths, this is sort of a heroic moment when you think about it. I guess one of the many things Han Min-yo is good at is absolutely crushing our expectations even beyond the grave. Up next is a dual entry, Hyun-ju and Jung-bae. Their worst deed was one they each only did once, voting to continue the games. Unlike in Season 1, this time around, players were given the chance to vote on whether or not they wanted to continue the games. While Jung-bae and Hyun-ju were both generally good people, they each voted to continue the games at one point, despite being teamed up with multiple people who were openly opposed to continuing. For Hyun-ju, this was a betrayal of her blossoming friendship with Young-mi, who she knew fully well was terrified to play any more of the games. And for Jung-bae, this undermined his friend's plan to finally shut down the game once and for all. But a mistake like this, especially under such severe pressure, wasn't enough to call their morals into question for us. They both apologized and made amends with their teammates, proceeding to vote X going forward, and even to help Gi-hun stage his revolt. So we'd say they've more than made up for it. Rounding out this category is the character who was the toughest to rank on this list, and it's none other than Gi-hun, whose worst deed was not seeing his daughter. This might be a surprising choice since Gi-hun did a lot of other bad things that were more immediately messed up. He was willing to take advantage of Il-nam's mental state to win the marble game, despite the two of them being good friends at that point, and later on he even accepted the fact that some people would have to die for the Squid Game to actually be shut down. But both of these have one thing in common: they were done out of sheer desperation. The first one, Gi-hun did to survive, and the second one he did to save the few people he actually could, because, let's face it, there was just no convincing the whole room to vote to stop the game. What's more, Gi-hun's decision to go back to such a horrific place for the sake of saving hundreds of innocent, unknowing lives came from a place of truly heroic conviction. But it came at a serious sacrifice. He didn't fly to the USA to see his daughter, instead spending 3 years in Korea trying to track down the people behind the Squid Game. It's not so much the fact that Gi-hun prioritized saving those lives, if anything, that makes him even more heroic, but it's the fact that he hasn't really committed to rebuilding his relationship with his daughter. Even just 1 week in the USA to catch up would have meant the world to her, and he could absolutely afford it now, which makes it all the more frustrating that he's been putting his kid on the back burner. We do have to take his feelings into account, of course. This could be partially due to guilt over how he prioritized his own needs over hers in the past, or even just a simple desire to protect her from the dangerous life he's currently living. Even so, his daughter is only a child for so long, and the fact that he's not likely going to have much, if any, of a relationship with her throughout that time is pretty sad. We hope they're able to reconcile one day, but for now it looks like Gi-hun's weakest point of morality is his role as a father. But he's still nowhere near the moral lows of these next several characters. These guys and gals did bad enough things to call their entire character into question, but not quite enough to fully condemn them. These are the terrible but forgivable deeds. Kicking off this section, we have almost everyone's least favorite newcomer from Season 2, Seon-nyo, whose worst deed was cursing her former allies. After being left out of the group for one round in the Mingle game, Seon-nyo decides that justice needs to be served to her treacherous teammates who committed the terrible crime of playing the game by the rules. She decides to curse them in the hopes that they would die. Now, on one hand, this is a pretty harmless deed in an objective sense. I don't think Shaman Lady's Nay's naysaying is going to be what takes Hyun-ju and the gang out of the game. But on the other hand, given how delusional she is, it's safe to say she absolutely intended to get them killed. As goofy as it may sound, this is technically multiple attempted homicides in one, but since nothing technically happened, she could hypothetically just say, "Hey, my bad," and the others would probably be chill with her from then on out. As bad as running a sort of crypto scam is, Myung-gi still has one deed under his belt that's worse: getting Jung-bae killed to save himself. It's admittedly tough to look on this one objectively because Jung-bae was just such a sweetheart of a character. Watching her beg for help from her Unni was heartbreaking, so it's pretty easy to hate Myung-gi for technically signing her death warrant. But at the same time, friendships aside, you have to remember that this whole game is a battle for survival. Myung-gi callously pulling Hyun-ju back into the room may have prevented her from saving Jung-bae, but it also prevented Hyun-ju herself, not to mention everyone else in the room, from dying. It was a tough situation and not one he took any pleasure in, but he did what he had to in order to survive, which makes this one of the more forgivable homicides in the series. What an incredibly low bar we're working with today. Now let's talk about a fan favorite from season 1, Sae-byeok. Her worst deed was working for Jok-soo. We don't really get too much detail on what exactly the details of Sae-byeok's relationship with Jok-soo were. All that we do know is that one way or another, she was involved with Jok-soo as one of the brutal gangster's employees. She apparently went independent at some point, which implies that she's got more than her fair share of crimes under her belt that even Jok-soo didn't have anything to do with. She's not above pickpocketing people or even threatening them if the need arises, like we saw with her broker in season 1. I think it's safe to say that Sae-byeok probably has one of the highest quantities of crime out of all the characters on this list. But like the majority of the players, all she really wants is to get a better, more peaceful life for herself and her family. Having grown up in a war-torn North Korea, she was pretty much steeped in a culture full of constant bloodshed. Compared to that, gang life probably seemed like a step up, especially considering that all she really wanted was to reunite her family under one roof. That's noble, and we have to give her credit for becoming a more selfless, compassionate person towards people outside of her family throughout the first season. But given the sheer quantity of her crimes, we have to rank her a bit lower despite her growth. Anyone working with a guy like Jok-soo has definitely got some serious explaining to do. Following her is another defector, No-yud, whose worst deed was acting as a Squid Game worker. No-yud is a defector from North Korea who just wants to find her daughter and bring her to the south to live peacefully. That's about as noble as it gets in terms of motivation, which is why it's a shame that the path to that goal is riddled with so much bloodshed. When she's recruited to work at the Squid Game, all she was told was that she'd be putting people out of their misery, with the little detail that these weren't terminally ill people, but rather desperate victims of poverty and extreme debt, conveniently left out. While No-yud is doing plenty of horrible stuff, most notably the mass murder thing, she doesn't really have much of a choice with how deep she's gotten into her role already. We could definitely see her righting her wrongs in season 3, but for now we have to place her relatively low for the sheer amount of people she's killed. On the surface, this next character's worst deed sounds a lot more reasonable than the previous few, but hear us out when we say that next up is Yong-sik. His worst deed is endangering his mother via gambling debts. Yong-sik is far from the only character in the series to suffer from gambling addiction, but his addiction went so far that his own elderly mother was worried to such an extent that she entered the games to pay off his debts. Out of desperation, he also voted to keep the games going at one point, since his debt was even worse than he let on, to the point where he was in danger of having several of his body parts collected as collateral. We can't blame him for wanting out of that situation by any means necessary, but on the other hand, by staying in the Squid Game, he could potentially be losing all of his body parts, not to mention endangering the life of his own mother, which is especially low given how much she's done for him, but at least he's seemingly dedicated to sticking with her in the games wherever it's possible. Loyalty counts for something, right? Well, and not if you're asking Min-soo, that is. His worst deed was his betrayal of Se-mi. Okay, betrayal is a bit of a strong word, but it's the closest thing that describes how awful Min-soo was to his only friend in the entire game. We've already talked about how much of an angel Se-mi is, especially considering that she's the only one who was willing to take Min-soo under her wing as a friend and teammate. But despite being scouted by the Se-mi herself, Min-soo constantly took advantage of her kindness. In the Mingle game, he turned down her offer to stick together and instead tricked her by stealing her place in the next room with Thanos and Namgyu. Even worse, later on he tries to save Se-mi's life when she's being attacked by Namgyu by dropping a bottle near him. We don't condemn Min-soo for missing, but we condemn him for not using this distraction to sneak up on Namgyu or get help or something. Instead, he just sits there and lets his only friend be murdered by one of his own bullies. While his desire to survive is completely understandable, his willingness to throw anyone and everyone else under the bus to do so makes him one of the least likable characters in the show. Also, for anyone still still feeling sorry for him. Remember, this man is 27 years old. He has every right to be afraid, but this is a grown man who's responsible for his own cowardice. In a similar vein, next is Dae-ho, the former Marine whose worst deed was failing to bring ammo to his team. Admittedly, we were a bit hard on Dae-ho in our good to evil ranking, but as nice of a guy as he was overall, it's just hard to ignore such a colossal misstep as he had in the season finale. Tasked with going back to retrieve ammo for his allies, Dae-ho was struck by either PTSD or an outright panic attack and failed to deliver the ammo as a result. Mental health struggles and trauma are big deals, so we aren't gonna hate on Dae-ho for that, but the fact is that he was a Marine and proud of it. When the time came for him to put his training to good use, he froze up and cost his friends precious time that ultimately contributed to some of them flat out dying. This is one of those deeds that could end up significantly higher or lower on the list depending on how the rest of the series plays out, but for right now, it was one of the most noteworthy screw-ups of the series so far. It hurts to see such an undeniably good man fall from grace in that moment, because it felt so real. Like Min-soo's cowardice, we could see a lot of people panicking like Dae-ho did here in real life. While it was a serious screw-up, it's not something that he's beyond redemption for. So, how about something a little less realistic now? Myung-gi, the doctor from season 1, has the very predictable worst deed of assisting an organ harvesting operation. Honestly, we get it. No, not the organ harvesting thing, that's disgusting, but we do understand the need to use whatever skill set you have to survive in an environment like the Squid Game. But there are some times when that can go a little too far, like, for instance, helping perform post-mortem surgeries on victims to make the scumbags behind the game even richer, and that's not even mentioning the fact that some of these contestants weren't even dead yet, meaning that Myung-gi was willing to prolong the suffering of murder victims just to possibly save his own tail. We would write him off as a supervillain if it weren't for the crappy situation he was stuck in. Woo-seok and Mr. Kim are our next duel entry, and their worst deed boils down to their occupations, working as gangsters and loan sharks. First off, did anyone else completely miss the detail that Mr. Kim is that same loan shark from season 1, episode 1 who threatened Gi-hun? Yeah, seeing him work in cooperation with Gi-hun after he's paid him back really makes you see the guy in a different light, as does his willingness to sacrifice his life to make sure Woo-seok can live to see his wife again. Even so, that doesn't make these two model citizens by any means. They're still gangsters who are more than willing to prioritize money over people's lives and to commit any number of crimes if they're paid properly. They aren't outright bad people. In fact, Woo-seok seems like he's on the way to a sort of redemption arc, but we still can't call them innocent given how their occupation is one of the most ruthless in existence, and has hurt a lot of vulnerable people over the years. But with that, we've reached the category of the characters who committed truly irredeemable deeds. These are the types of misdeeds that pretty much guarantee you a bad to evil category spot in our usual format, and for the Squid Game, there are a lot of people who fit that description. The first character in this category is Thanos, whose worst deed was also one of his first, killing several players in red light, green light. If there were ever any doubt that Thanos was a bad guy, this moment from the first game erased it. After being advised that hiding behind fellow players and moving in a single file line is the best way to guarantee survival, Thanos makes the perfectly rational choice to push the several people in front of him over, and to make matters worse, he didn't even tell them it was just a prank, bro. Not only did Thanos kill several people for quite literally no reason, but he did so when it would only serve to make the game more difficult for him. It's such a level of insanity that's almost impressive, but since Thanos is very clearly on drugs, we won't place him lower than the people with more cold-blooded murders on their records, and who did them with more sober minds. With that, let's move on to the villain of season 1, Sung-woo. This guy had plenty of bad deeds, but we chose murdering Sae-byeok as his most unforgivable. With Ali and the guy who could tell the tiles apart in glass stepping stones, while we couldn't justify what Sung-woo did for them, we could at least defend him somewhat as doing what was necessary to survive. In the marble game, it was quite literally either Sung-woo or Ali who would survive, and in the glass stepping stones game, the clock was running down to the point where the rest of the group wouldn't have been able to finish crossing if Mr. Glassman didn't hurry up. But then there's Sae-byeok, a young woman and former teammate of Sung-woo's who wanted nothing more than to reunite her family. Thanks to the completely unnecessary glass explosion at the end of the game, Sae-byeok was already severely wounded and had lost a lot of blood, but in a moment of true depravity and cowardice, Sung-woo waited until Gi-hun went to get help for her and murdered her for no reason other than to make the game easier on himself. With Ali, there was quite literally no way for Sung-woo to survive if he lived as well. With the glass dude, it may have been possible, but it was just too risky. But with Sae-byeok, he could have competed with her, but he didn't even want to give this already dying girl the a chance to go down fighting. It was only a matter of time before we got to the infamous Nam-gyu, whose worst deed was, of course, murdering Se-mi. While Thanos usually relied on a mix of manipulation and charisma to control people, Nam-gyu was more of an open bully. He was one of the most unapologetically greedy, cruel people in the running, but even for him, stabbing Se-mi to death was a whole new level of evil. This wouldn't make things much easier on him, since Se-mi was admittedly one of the less physically strong competitors in the running at that point. If anything, since he and Se-mi were technically allies, it would actually hurt his chances, but the guy was just spiteful and bitter and wanted to assert his dominance now that Thanos was gone by killing an innocent girl who never did anything to him aside from a few sarcastic remarks. But while we don't really see him directly murder anyone, we'd argue that Jeong-dae did even more to hurt others' chances of survival. His worst deed was also pretty much his only deed, rallying people to continue the games. Jeong-dae is a powerful man, but he's a powerful man in one of, if not the most debt in the entire competition. As a result, he uses his powers of persuasion to convince the other players that Gi-hun and his allies are lying about how dangerous the games are, or that they're actually the bad guys trying to keep the prize for themselves, or basically however he can possibly spin the story so that it sounds like having countless people murdered so the prize money will increase is totally worthwhile. The only reason this guy isn't even lower is the fact that he does have a serious debt to pay off, but like, so does everyone else here, dude. The fact that he's so openly excited about seeing more people die so he can pay his own debts speaks volumes to just how selfish and callous of a man he is. And since his speeches led plenty of people to their doom, we have to place him pretty close to the bottom of our countdown. Speaking of selfish and callous, while they're just shy of the bottom 5, next we have the most depraved characters in the entire series, the VIPs. Their worst deed, of course, is watching and betting on the Squid Game players. Now, this might be a controversial placement for them since, again, they are without a doubt the most vile human beings in the series. The way they see the players as nothing more than playthings for their own entertainment and possibly profit is a testament to just how far gone these guys are.
You two bet so much on number 69.
Oh, it's such a beautiful number! 69!
Oh, you dirty dog.
There's no amount of pain, torture, or straight up assault that phases them, unless it's against them, of course. They're nothing more than stuck-up rich guys who can't find anything better to do than watch people be annihilated in horrific ways. So why are they so relatively high? Well, that's simple. While they take pleasure in perhaps the most depraved form of entertainment possible, they aren't actually doing what they watch. I mean, sure, off screen, I'd be more shocked if these guys didn't have some literal skeletons in their closets. One of them literally started molesting one of the workers because he was bored with the carnage. But as far as we see, these guys aren't the type to directly do unspeakable things, just the type to have others do them so they can take uncomfortable pleasure in watching. As horrific as they are, the only thing that could be much worse than people like the VIPs is enabling them. With that, we have to talk about the twist villain of the season, Captain Park. This guy's a bit tricky since we don't know why he did what he did, but we can definitely accuse him of killing a man and probably aiding the front man. When Captain Park was first introduced this season, he seemed like a pretty great guy. That was, until it was revealed that he was sabotaging the team's attempts to find the Squid Game island. When one of his crewmates discovers him tampering with one of their drones, he throws him overboard to avoid any suspicion, which, like, wouldn't they just notice that one of their crewmates is gone anyway? I guess he's gonna rely on good old-fashioned lying to keep as much scrutiny away from him as possible. While we won't place him any lower since he's almost certainly answering to someone more powerful, we have to condemn his actions for the sole reason that he's deliberately keeping Jun-hee from exposing the horrors of the Squid Game to the world, all the while playing the role of a friendly neighborhood fisherman. So with that, let's move on to his probable boss, In-ho, whose worst deed is running the Squid Game. Okay, maybe we were a bit too harsh on In-ho in our good to evil. He does seem to be a genuinely broken man who at the very least has some level of care left for his brother. But no amount of justification could even come close to making his decision to become the front man okay. In-ho competed in the Squid Game, so he knew full well about the horrors it held, and yet he still decided to run the game itself, sending hundreds of people to their doom. He may be justified in his own eyes, since he was technically right about the people being there of their own volition, but that doesn't excuse him helping to execute a game that effectively transforms vulnerable people into racehorses, except I'm pretty sure even racehorses don't get shot when they lose a single race. The worst part of that is, having lost his job over accepting a bribe to pay for his dying wife's medical procedures, In-ho knows better than anyone what it's like to be financially taken advantage of, and he's still helping other poor vulnerable people fall victim to the same fate. But not every poor and vulnerable person recruited to the Squid Games is a sympathetic figure. Our bronze medal of evil goes to Deok-su for being Deok-su. Yeah, I know it feels kind of mean to put it like that, but come on, man. This guy's a gangster who's killed numerous people and has been shown to laugh at the misery of others, even laughing at 69, hanging himself over the guilt he felt after his wife's death.
69.
Deok-soo is the type of guy who would kill someone for looking at him wrong if the mood struck him. But what makes him even worse is the fact that he seems to be fully in control of himself. Never does it feel like Deok-soo is incapable of holding back. On the contrary, he can actually be pretty sharp and calculating at times. So every evil thing he does is presumably something he's thought through and doesn't regret. The silver medal of evil goes to the suit man, whose worst deed was recruiting countless vulnerable people to their deaths. The suit man finally got fleshed out at the beginning of season 2, and man, this guy was more of an absolute freak than we could have imagined. He once worked as one of the pink-hooded staff members on the Squid Game, executing players who needed to be eliminated for losing a game. This all came to a head when he encountered his own father, and the sight of him begging for his life changed absolutely nothing. In fact, it encouraged him. The fact that he felt nothing as he saw the fear in his old man's eyes made him readier than ever to keep on killing people, and to recruit vulnerable people to compete in the Squid Game so he'd keep having more people to kill. The suit man wasn't in any outrageous debts that we know of, which makes him stand out from the already twisted staff behind the Squid Game. But while the suit man's kill count is horrific, I think it's fairly obvious who has the most revolting deed in Squid Game history. That dishonor goes to Il-nam, whose worst deed, of course, was founding the Squid Game. Oh, how we long for the 6 episodes where Il-nam seemed like a goofy, sweet old man with a brain tumor.
He is a good boy.
Now, he was actually a man with a brain tumor, but he was neither goofy nor sweet. As a former loan shark, man, that is a very common theme in this series, Il-nam had plenty of wealthy clients who would complain about how bored they were.
I've got all this money, and I don't know what to do with it. And I'm hungry. Who's there?
So, Il-nam, in his infinite wisdom, said, "Hey, you know what would be fun? What if we took 456, yes, specifically that number, of people, manipulated them into playing children's games for money, and then we kill them if they lose?" And so the Squid Game's twisted origin was set in stone. I don't think it needs to be explained why this deed is so horrible, so instead I'll point out the sheer scope of evil on display here. See, Gi-hun was a competitor in the 33rd Squid Game. It was an annual competition running since 1988, with 2020 being the 33rd installment. Since season 2 takes place in 2024, that means Gi-hun is currently part of the 37th Squid Game, so we have 36 completed Squid Games so far. Every competition, as far as we know it, has 456 players, and while some probably chose to stay out when or if they got the chance, it was probably a very slim minority, so let's assume about 400 people died each competition. If we assume all those statistics, Il-nam's twisted game is responsible for the deaths of, get ready for this, 14,000 people. Even if we're wrong, it's still almost certainly at least like 10,000 people. Hope your fun was worth it, Il-nam.